it's a socio-economic thing where they actually get to work to study how remittances move, what these people are like. For a lot of us, the real blue-collar people remitting money are very different from us, to be very honest. Like we talked about the labor camps, and when these students visit those labor camps, they get a shock of reality, to be very honest. And for a lot of our markets, that's the real world. We are, living in hotels today where the rent is 1 month's remittance for these guys. And that remittance is, from the social aspect, changing a lot in our countries. And we started off in India because we're based out of India, but we need a lot more of these students. And over here we are from various countries. So if you have children, you have good people approaching you who are interested in working with us on these internships, I would be very glad to work with you. And if I can have somebody from Sudan who's working with me on the Sudan corridor, somebody from Pakistan who's working on the Pakistan corridor, somebody from Turkey, or a lot of the countries we're representing today. I think together we can create this large ecosystem, and we're helping we're doing the social cause, but we're actually helping the kids realize what is reality in the privileged lives they live today. Anyway, so we have Aditya Aluwalia. He's done a brief study on a few remittance corridors and the effect of remittances on some of the markets. I'd request him to come forward.
Good afternoon all. My name is Aditya. I hope you're enjoying your stay here and the conference so far. I'm a 17-year-old student, and I'm a part of and proud to represent my school, the Shriram School of Ravagiri in Gurgaon. I'm extremely thankful for TERA for bestowing upon me this student internship, and also Mr. Amber Soor, who's been my guide and mentor through the progression of this remittance project over the past couple of months. Next slide. Just to reiterate what remittances are, they're basically funds which migrants or people living in any other alien territory send back home to their native country, to their friends, families, etc. And while we're still on the page of remittances, I would like to take this opportunity to enlist some interesting facts about remittances. Over 220 million migrants in the world send over $450 billion in form of remittances in the developing countries. And in most developing countries, the remittance receipts have exceeded the ODA, which is the official development assistance, by 3 times. And in most of the developed countries in the world, remittance flows have exceeded the net FDI flows. And around 30 to 40% of the remittance receipts go to the rural parts of the particular country. In the coming 5 years, the total remittance receipts are projected to surpass 2.5 trillion USD. And also, most of the remittances happen at a domestic and not at an international level. And remittance transfers using mobile phones is becoming a cheaper means of technology. In the countries of Ghana and Uganda, remittance receipts have played an important role in reducing the percentage of poor people by 5 and 11% respectively. And in Tajikistan, remittance receipts have accounted for around half of the GDP throughout 2011 to 2014. And in the countries of Liberia and Somalia, remittance receipts have accounted for around 1/4 of the total GDP. So, in terms of remittances received, India tops it all with close to $70 billion received in the year 2014. It's followed by China, just $10 billion down, Philippines, Mexico, Nigeria, Egypt, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Ukraine. Then this is of the remittance received per total percentage of the GDP. As I mentioned before, around half of the GDP is of remittances in Tajikistan. So yeah, this is the top 10. We have Nepal, Somalia, Lesotho, Haiti, etc. Now this is again remittance receipts of GDP between two countries in a corridor. So again we see Tajikistan, Russia corridor 21.6 and so on and so forth. And so in terms of countries in outgoing remittance receipts, the USA tops it by $131 billion, followed by Saudi, UAE, UK, Germany, etc. And yeah, the US has come to play a predominant role in this. So, in the following PPT, I've studied remittances with respect to 4 of the remittance corridors in the world. Now, these 4 remittance corridors aren't necessarily the biggest, but I've chosen them in a manner so as to cover most of the geographical territories in the world. So the first remittance corridor, which is a white collar corridor, is the US-India, which tends to cover the eastern and western outlooks. Then we have US-Mexico cross-border remittance corridor in the western side of the world. Then in the African region, we have the Zimbabwe-South Africa remittance corridor. And in the Asian Middle East region, I've gone for the Qatar-Nepal corridor. So, before I move any further, I should mention that in each remittance corridor, I've compared the personal remittances received by the country concerned with 3 other economic indicators. GDP is a constant indicator for all, and I've compared it to 2 other indicators as I personally deemed fit for the project. So for USA, it's the personal remittances received by USA versus the balance of payments, the GDP, and the exports. And for India, I've done it obviously GDP, and it's pretty prevalent in India that parts of urban and rural India have infrastructural problems. So I've compared the remittances received to WEF, which is the quality of port infrastructure, and also overpopulation is a social evil / characteristic in India. So I've compared to the population density per square kilometer. Both USA and India have faced an upward graph in terms of personal remittances received and the GDP. So due to the sheer size of the US economy, the personal remittances have accounted for around 0.1, 0.2% throughout 2011 and 14. And despite the huge sum of remittances received by India, the remittances have accounted for around 3.4, 3.8, close to 4% of the Indian economy. For the US-Mexico corridor, I have compared in Mexico the personal remittances received along with GDP, literacy level, and the FDI net inflows. And similarly for the Zimbabwe-South Africa corridor, I've kept GDP as a constant. For Zimbabwe particularly, I've compared it to the government expenditure on education and CPIA, which is the social protection scale between 1 to 6. And for South Africa, I've compared it obviously with GDP, urban development, and bank capital asset ratio. And for the Qatar and the Nepalese remittance corridor, I have drawn a comparison between the deposit oil interest rates in Qatar, the GDP, and the deposit asset ratio. And for Nepal, I've compared the remittance receipts to GDP, the access to electricity by the Nepalese population, and the agricultural development in Nepal. Now, the US-India corridor, the US and India both the pretty much big bosses in remittance. US is the highest sending highest country for outgoing remittances, whereas India is the highest country for incoming remittances. And yeah, so here the graph below shows how the remittance receipts in India. It's been up and down here and there. It's gone down in a couple of places, but it's hit its peak around July 2015. And yeah, it's been on a constant rise throughout the last couple of years. Now, the US-Mexico remittance corridor is the largest migrant remittance corridor in the world. Around 11.8 million migrants from Mexico currently stay in the United States, and most of them send money back home to Mexico. And they have sort of an inverse relationship. The USA is the highest receiving country for Mexican remittances, whereas Mexico is the highest receiving country for American remittances. Now, for a similar case for Zimbabwe and South Africa, there are a lot of migrants who migrate from Zimbabwe and work in South Africa. Around 91% of the Zimbabwean migrants in South Africa send money back home as form of remittances. And for this remittance corridor, it's more about sustainability. The remittance receipts sent back home to Zimbabwe are used for sustaining the livelihood and the survival of households, and also for considerably raising the standards of living. So this is a pretty interesting survey showing the expenses of remittance by households. As it's a pretty big figure, total of 85% of remittances are used for all general daily households, and especially for housing, gifts, building, entertainment, etc. It's pretty high. And also Amber sir and Faisal sir, they mentioned it before, that a lot of remittance receipts are used just as form of gifts, like someone's daughter got good marks, they send her back home. A father can't be home at his son's birthday, he sends remittance back home. Some relative passes away, they send back home. That all of those come under the gifts category. So that is pretty high. So for the Qatar-Nepal remittance corridor, Qatar plays a predominant role as an remittance country, as the outgoing remittance country, whereas Nepal has come to receive a lot of remittances. Around 7% of the remittance flows from Qatar have gone to Nepal. So this is just a graph showing the remittance receipts by Nepal. It was around 2 million in 2000, and it's been a little zigzag, but it's been consistently going up, and it's hit close to above $3 billion in 2009. So I'd actually like to conclude my brief presentation by enlisting some of the few challenges and the advantages of remittances. So one of them is a few workers working in cyclic industries such as the construction industry may lose their job, and it's argued that remittances may downturn in the global economy. And also there is a fact of exorbitant cost for remittances. It's around 8% globally. That means if someone sends 100 rupees from point A to point B, the recipient on point B will get 92 rupees. And the same is 20% within Africa and around 92% within Venezuela. So if you see the advantages of remittances, they've helped in the alleviation of poverty, for sustaining households, and for general survival of many households. And I actually haven't mentioned this, but in the country of Nepal, remittances have helped reduce the poverty level from 42% in 1995 to 31% in 2005, which is a 1.1% poverty reduction per annum. And remittances have helped in the growth of output. They help in the upgrading of farm production, in the formation of small business enterprises. So in the countries of Thailand and Pakistan, the migrant families use the remittance receipts for hiring labor and upgrading their farm material, which leads to a considerable growth of output in that sector. And also remittances with respect to the international capital market. The countries of Turkey, Brazil, El Salvador, Panama and Mexico have used the future remittance flows to add additional funds as a collateral in the international capital market. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditya. Like I said, this is part of our student intern program, and I would love to have students from all over the world actually participating in this. I can promise you that they'll end up doing really good projects. So if you have anybody who you have in mind, our restriction is we want to have kids from different continents. So please drop me a line. I'd be happy to work with them. Again, thank you, Aditya. Great presentation. I mean, he's a 12th standard kid, so from that perspective, I think it's great. At least it gives him an idea of what this money is doing. And when you have a worker working home, trying to save every paise, every penny and send it home, that's what it means. Next we have Eden. Eden is from Ovum, and we're slightly changing the presentation. The first half was on remittances, mobile remittances. Now we're going to start talking about wallets. So we have Eden, who's going to talk about effect of wallets in the industry. Eden is a leading analyst from Ovum, so let me give it to him. Thank you.
Well, hello everybody. Yes, Amber, thanks for the introduction. And I'm not going to talk about international remittances. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing from you, but hopefully a little bit of a change of direction. Can I just ask, how many operators are with us today? Okay, a couple. Good. All right. Well, my presentation probably has a slightly more operator-centric focus than some of the sessions this morning, so, I'm on your side, guys. And what I'm going to do is look at some of the sort of, can you hear me all right? Is this switched on? That's a bit better, isn't it? So I'm going to look at some of the key trends around mobile payments and mobile commerce in its entirety. So a much broader focus than earlier today. And I'm going to do this by looking at a cluster of trends around technology, services and the consumer perspective. We can sometimes forget about consumers when we talk about technology, service trends and strategies. And I'm going to share some findings from a fairly broad-ranging consumer survey that we recently conducted. 17 countries, 8,500 consumers, mature and emerging markets. So, first of all, key technology trends. I should add that a lot of the stuff I'm talking about has a mature market perspective, but I think the general trajectory with a lot of this stuff is not that dissimilar, even if the dynamics are. So you can't really talk about technology without mentioning NFC. In the mature markets I look at, it's a key focus for operators, almost to the point of obsession. The problem is that the NFC story so far doesn't make for overly happy reading. Progress has been slow. Things are improving. Device availability, i.e. NFC-enabled smartphones, is no longer the issue it was. Pretty much every single major device manufacturer now ships NFC-enabled smartphones. Good news. GSMA has some pretty compelling stats that show there's a lot of activity globally around NFC, so that's another positive. But I think actually if you look a little bit more closely, a lot of these launches are more at the same stage of sort of soft launches and trials. There's a couple of issues that have been dogging NFC. The major one, on the face of it, relates to arguments about where the secure element should reside. Should it be embedded in the device chipset? Should it be living on the NFC SIM card, or should it be in the cloud? These arguments are actually more about the control of service provisioning, the customer relationship and the business model. And this is one reason why it's caused so much contention. The other issue with NFC is the way it's being presented to consumers, which is basically in a very poor way. What we typically say to consumers is that NFC payments on your mobile phones is a transition or the next step up or the alternative to payments with your credit and debit cards, contactless if you have them. Now that's really not proving very compelling for consumers. And this in turn is making a lot of merchants hesitant about investing. So you've got this sort of chicken and egg scenario. But it will get better. Postcard emulation, which I'm sure most of you have heard about, provides an alternative to NFC SIM card-based implementations. A lot of banks have embraced it. A lot of other service providers are warming to it. It basically gives them more flexibility over service provisioning. So this should open up the market to a lot more innovation and hopefully stimulate service uptake for NFC proximity payments. It's not necessarily good news for operators. Operators favour NFC-based SIM implementations because it gives you more control over the customer relationship and basically monetization. Third parties don't like this. There are ways around this, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later in the afternoon, but there are hybrid solutions that combine SIM-based NFC and host card emulation. The SIM card NFC handles the security, the cloud provides for the flexibility around provisioning. A lot of operators, even though they won't admit it publicly, are looking at this sort of solution. Biometrics. We talked about this a little bit this morning in the context of international remittances and authentication. And it clearly is very important for added security layers. But we actually think it's probably even more important in terms of the user experience. And I'm going to come back to the user experience a lot because frankly for a lot of payment applications it's still not very good. So I think biometrics is a technology that really can help in this area. Bluetooth low energy beacons. In the markets I look at, it's caused a lot of excitement. There's been a lot of experimentation among retailers, and you can sort of understand why. I don't know how familiar you are with BLE beacons, but it's on the face of it a very nice concept. Basically you have these tiny little sensors, they're not very expensive, they're reasonably easy to deploy. Retailers can put them around their premises in a GFS. And the idea is when a consumer with a BLE enabled smartphone with the BLE application downloaded comes into proximity of one of these BLE sensors, it triggers an action on the device, typically a marketing message, so a push-through coupon or voucher or offer from the retailer that's implemented this. A lot of retailers like this, but a lot of them are now actually having second thoughts about BLE. I've spoken to some retailers and they've said in the sort of trials and experiments they've carried out, they've kind of run into these issues here. A lot of consumers don't like to have Bluetooth switched on because they feel it's going to drain battery life. They've also got to download the BLE application. And a lot of the retailers I've spoken to said it's actually quite hard to get consumers to do this. They think sort of, well, why should we? What is this application going to do for us? It's more clutter on my device. And privacy issues are heightened. Location in general makes consumers very nervous. There's this sort of big brother element to it. And this idea of sort of real hyperlocation makes them even more nervous. So for these reasons, I think it's going to be the larger retailers that embrace BLE beacons. The smaller guys are keeping well clear of it. Wearable devices. Actually, Swatch has just announced that they're going to introduce a watch that supports. They're putting an embedded chip in the watch, and it's going to enable contactless payments. And there's a couple of other wearable tech coming to market. These are from some of our own forecasts. There's different sort of cuts to that. We also split forecast by how intelligent wearable devices are. Some of them are really quite dumb and don't do a lot at all. As you can see, it is growing quite well. Still is pretty small compared to the smartphone market. Our feeling is that wearable tech, wearable devices could be a good platform for certain types of payment application, sort of convenience, tap and go type applications. But I think the prospect of wearable devices becoming a mainstream platform for mobile payments is debatable. It clearly still is a market that lacks scale. It's highly fragmented. For developers, it's creating a whole new set of challenges. You know, they're having to develop for new form factors, totally different usage scenarios. And the other factor is what's highlighted there in the chart. Now, this is from our ongoing Consumer Insights programme, and it was findings from last year's survey. But clearly most consumers are still sitting on the shelf when it comes to wearable tech. And I think in the payment scenario, it's probably a case of too much too soon. I mean, let's see what happens when we get the results from our 2015 survey back. Maybe sentiment was proving, but I think at the moment, too much too soon for consumers. Now I'm going to move on to key trends around services. And this is going to pick up some of the themes from this morning, but mostly take us into the wider mobile commerce domain. When we look at mobile payments, I actually prefer to call it mobile commerce. You know, we've all been focusing very much on this part of the story. But actually, mobile commerce in its entirety deals about more than just the core payment applications. It's about mobile marketing applications in the form of loyalty, rewards, advertising, mobile coupons and vouchers, location-based services, which can be in-store navigation, geofencing, applications that can drive users to a physical store and hopefully end up with those users making a mobile payment. A digital wallet can also contain applications around ticketing and transport, and of course the core banking and financial services apps. So it's actually a very rich environment. The reality is that most of the early mobile or digital wallet launches were not truly multifunctional. Most of them sort of gravitated towards this end of the spectrum, where they were really focusing purely on payments. And this was particularly pronounced with operator mobile wallets, where the focus was, in most cases, 100% on NFC mobile proximity payments in store, and actually some of them still do that. At the other end of the spectrum are mobile wallets that focus very much on the sort of loyalty and marketing space. And the reason they did this, because in mature markets at least, the core payment applications weren't proved that compelling. So the reason was that if you started to wrap these other apps around the core payment app, it would prove more exciting for consumers. And this is what some of those guys on the corners have done. You know, for the retailers, it's a key element to their mobile payment strategy. The reasons that Starbucks payment application has been so successful is because it's basically an extension of an already successful loyalty program. SK Smart Wallet in South Korea, it actually makes decent revenues from its loyalty and marketing proposition. Basically acts as an aggregator for third parties to membership and reward schemes. And it charges those third parties a fee every time when they load their application into the SK Smart Wallet. And then there's another fee structure for every time a user uses that third party loyalty or reward system. So it's finding that proposition quite compelling. The good news is that more wallets are becoming what I've deemed truly multifunctional. So they support the core payment applications, remote proximity. They also support ticketing. They also, particularly in the case of emerging markets, support those really important mobile financial services. And in the case of sort of mature markets, the emphasis is very much on marketing type applications. But we are seeing more truly multifunctional wallets come into the market. I said I won't focus on international remittances, but I just wanted to highlight this service, which is a UK example. I like Pay and Ping It, basically because, well, Ping It, it's a really great service. It's launched by Barclays Bank in the UK. They did this in 7 months or so, they claimed, set up a dedicated team. They said they had a startup mentality. They built a proposition with the user experience in mind. And Ping It is about more than just domestic P2P remittances. It hasn't implemented all of these features, but it has done a lot of them. And what they've really tried to do here is focus on user experience and build a sort of a P2P proposition that's really contextual. So you can use it to pay merchants, you can personalise it with images, with messaging. It's a really good application, and some of the KPIs I've highlighted there evidence that. Paint is now integrated to Payen, pronounced Payen. And this it's a really unprecedented initiative, even more than switching in Sweden. It's a proposition that's backed by all the major UK banks and building societies, and it basically links current accounts to a mobile phone number for faster mobile transfers. And the banks reckon it collectively reaches about 90% of UK bank accounts. Again, that's pretty impressive. And again, you can see some of the early stage KPIs that suggest they're moving in the right direction. Another sort of hot area is so-called social commerce, which is basically payments and related applications in messaging apps and on social media. Already some of the popular messaging apps like WeChat and Line support some payment capabilities. Facebook is clearly chasing payments very aggressively. I think it's only a matter of time before WhatsApp starts to sort of incorporate those functionalities. From a user perspective, I think it's it's still early phase, and these are some more results from our consumer survey, which shows sort of good, modest early traction. But I personally think this is a key trend to watch. I think the sort of convergence of payments and communications is fairly inevitable, and indeed it's already happening. And I was in AfricaCon the other week, and World Remit, a fairly young company, extremely ambitious, they're really sort of chasing this space, and they said they want to become the WhatsApp of remittances, and they're sort of actively seeking out agreements and deals with the messaging service providers. Where this leaves operators, I'm not too sure. Probably is quite worrying if you see sort of third-party payment providers and OTT players starting to cozy up. This is sort of building on the social, contextual personalisation theme, which is a sort of key trope running throughout the presentation. Location-based commerce, again, one of those areas that gets a lot of excitement and a fair amount of hype. There are a number of sort of location-based commerce applications out there, usually driven by the retailers. And that's pretty compelling. Real-time location lookups as a mean to drive sort of footfall to a retailer store is good. But I think it gets far more interesting if you start to layer on other demographics, other data insights. And I won't read through them all, but I've listed some of the sort of data points there. When you move to this sort of scenario, and we are not here yet, you're really looking at sort of geo-behavioural targeting. You're really looking at sort of bringing contextualisation to a payments proposition. And I think that will really sort of help the use case for payments, which for a lot of consumers simply isn't there. As I said, we are not anywhere near the sort of geo-behavioural targeting nirvana. There are clearly privacy issues here. Good news in sort of a lot of markets is that operators at least have some pretty good codes of practice in place and treat all this stuff on a strictly opt-in basis for consumers. And actually where location is involved, there's typically a double opt-in process where you have to have explicit agreement from consumers. Can't really sort of talk about the consumer payment services without mentioning Apple, though surprisingly we've managed to avoid them all the morning. The Apple effect, everybody was sort of shrieking and operators were getting fairly hysterical at the prospect of Apple arriving in the market. And actually it's one of the reasons that Weave in the UK, or at least a lot of the founding members, pushed out that venture. Weave was initially focused on sort of mobile marketing. The next stage in its evolution was meant to be mobile payments, including NFC proximity. They told me one of the reasons, not all the reasons, they stepped back, because they were worried about what Apple would do to the market. Clearly Apple has a lot going for it in the payments domain. I've highlighted some of the points there, I won't read through them all. But basically basically has been quite careful about not upsetting the existing payment rails. Wants to have a very dominating, controlling role, which, by the way, is one of the reasons it favours a sort of a device-based implementation for NFC. But it has won widespread support from banks, from retailers. It supports remote and proximity payments, and there are sort of rumours, though I think they will be substantiated, that it's going to move into the P2P remittances space. That could prove very intriguing. It was quick to open APIs to developers, and we touched on the importance of that. It's really, really good at marketing stuff as well. So it's got a lot going for it. And actually on the security angle, it's got biometrics, it's got tokenization, and obviously an embedded SEs around the device. It's also got a sort of a merchant-friendly proposition in that it's promised that it won't share merchant and third-party data. But does that mean that people have sort of rushed to embrace Apple Pay? I don't know if this surprises you or not. It did me. This is not our research. It's produced by an online sort of news service called Payments, with a typically sort of dark spelling, and a research company called InfoScout. Do not ask me why June doesn't add up to 100%. I guess they have some users giving sort of slightly dubious responses. But the bottom line is, even a player like Apple that has so many sort of things going in its favour is struggling. The last part of the deck is focused on some findings from a recent consumer survey. As I said, 17 markets, 8,500 consumers, a mix of mature and developing markets around the globe, so Europe, North America, Africa and Asia. So, hopefully fairly representative. This first slide actually shocked me slightly. This is basically about adoption status. What are people doing? Well, actually not a lot. When it comes to active usage, it's still fairly modest, as you can see from those top bars there. I guess the good news is that actually the majority of active users have already started to use slightly more advanced payments and mobile commerce applications, so that's pretty positive. The thing that probably surprised me most was this set of findings at the bottom there, that in emerging markets, among unbanked users, 50% of them said they don't know what a mobile payment service is. That did stun me slightly because the GSMA and mobile operators apparently do a lot of work in terms of raising awareness, getting that education out there, but it's still falling short of the mark. And it's ironic because clearly the unbanked people are those that would benefit the most from a mobile payment service, but a lot of them are still falling through the net. Again, a tap on last week, Eco Net Wireless were there, and they have a very good service called Eco Cash, and they're a fantastic example, but they really sort of try and do education at a grassroots level. So they go out to the sort of really quite remote rural villages. They try and get the village elders involved to call meetings, so they really can go out there and sort of try and explain to people why this will help them in terms of improvement in life quality. So there's still a lot of work there that's needed. This slide summarises some of the key barriers to adoption, why people don't want to take up mobile payment services. I don't think there's too many shockers there, but one thing that this slide does sort of get across quite forcibly is some of the sort of ongoing reasons to non-adoption are getting quite entrenched. Fears about security, the fundamental one that people think the basic technology is insecure. We know about that. What I found quite interesting is concerns over personal data. Now, when we asked this a couple of years ago, it wasn't as high on the agenda as worries about the technology sort of being vulnerable to fraud and so on. And also consumers in emerging markets are as concerned, or pretty much as concerned, about sort of personal data issues. And again, that surprised me slightly, maybe in a slightly condescending way, because you tend to think, well, this is a mature market concern. It's not. Consumers around the globe are worried about data privacy. The other sort of key barriers to adoption are these points there. The lack of perceived need. Consumers think that their existing payment instruments are good enough. In emerging economies, that's typically cash. In mature markets, it's our credit and debit cards typically. I'm going to sort of gallop through the next couple of slides. This is really just a snapshot of those active users. What kind of stuff, what applications are they currently using? This is focused on mobile financial services. The good news, and it sort of reiterates a lot of the positive messages we've heard about transfers. Transfers are a key service. I don't even count sort of checking bank balances because that's informational, it's not really a payment service. So transferring money is the key application. There's also pretty good usage of associated applications paying for utilities, gas, electricity and so on. Some early take-up on the sort of slightly more advanced microfinance products, but when we asked about sort of take-up of future applications, that area did score a lot of interest. Probably not such a happy slide. This was asking those same group of consumers, well, what's your sort of usage going to look like in the next 12 months? Good news for the emerging market participants here is your consumers are going to be driving usage. In mature markets, it's a slightly more sort of ambiguous story. The majority, sort of 60%, don't expect their usage to increase. Now, for me, that's a little bit worrying, because it suggests that if service providers don't address them, provide them with something that's compelling, interesting, then that sort of plateau, that sort of remain the same, it could actually degenerate. So that's something to really sort of be mindful for if you're a service provider in a mature market. Next two slides, kind of a repeat exercise, but looking at mobile commerce and mobile shopping type applications. I'm not going to read through results, I'm just going to pull out some of the things that sort of struck me with those findings. The main one was that actually consumers in emerging markets have quite a high propensity for mobile shopping, mobile commerce applications, and that's not always presumed to be the case. You know, most people, and even operators I talk to, just assume that consumers in emerging market want the core mobile money type services, which they do, of course. But you can see there's keen interest in mobile commerce apps. So it does mean that operators do have to have a roadmap in place to support that. I won't sort of dwell on this slide. Again, it's just asking about sort of future usage of mobile commerce applications. It's pretty much a repeat of the story with mobile financial services. Some fairly sort of optimistic, bullish outlooks for emerging markets. Users in mature markets are looking a little bit more jaded. This is a really interesting slide. Well, I think so anyway. It's asking the inevitable question around security. And this is asking the existing users, you know, how they deem sort of payments and personal data in the safety stakes. Now, actually, most of them think it's safe enough. And I think this is very positive. When you ask non-users about security, they'll say, oh, it's terrible, you know, well, that's the key reason we don't adopt payment services. But what this chart tells us is actually once people do adopt, their confidence in the security of mobile payments increases. Now, to me, that suggests a sort of adoption curve scenario, just as it was with other types of new payment instruments, withdrawing cash from an ATM, online payments. I think mobile payments and consumer confidence in security will improve with usage. The caveat to that is you've got to get them using this stuff in the first place. But I think this is a pretty positive take-out. We sort of ask this question pretty much every year, sort of who do you trust most to provide mobile payment services? I'm sure all the banks are sort of rubbing your hands in glee. They trust you most, consumers rate you guys. No surprise there. Operators, you kind of do okay, ish. I personally would have thought that the trust levels in operators in emerging markets would be higher than it is. In a couple of markets that we surveyed, they were actually trusted, actually in two, Ghana was one of them, more than the banks, but only in sort of 2 markets. But I would have thought operators would have been a bit higher in the trust stakes in emerging markets. They're not. Good news is you're ahead of sort of the mobile specialist applications, the social networks, but they are clearly snapping at your heels. And final slide is how to sort of drive loyalty. We asked consumers, and this is a slightly different sort of take on it. Okay, what sort of attributes and characteristics would make you trust a payment provider more? And these are the findings. Inevitably, security comes into the frame. So service provider with strong security, data protection credentials. Some of the other attributes I think are quite interesting because they don't relate directly to financial services. And I think this is quite positive for operators and other sort of non-banking payment service providers. Consumers clearly sort of rate and trust brands, respected brands, and I think in a lot of markets operators are respected brands. They also like being rewarded for usage, and actually there's a host of other slides. This comes up a lot. People are sort of very keen on rewards, and the idea of sort of being given coupons and discounts, etc., for use of a payment service is clearly quite appealing. It's something to think about, especially for the operators among the audience. And that kind of wraps up my sort of very quick gallop through key trends around technology, services, and the consumer's perspective. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eden. I found the second last slide very interesting, where even in emerging markets, the consumers still prefer the banks for their wallet, whereas we don't see too many bank wallets in emerging markets. Interesting. I'm sure if we had more operators here, they would they'd find that interesting. Lazarus, you have a question?
I think so. I wanted to talk about that slide as well. Just to find out, I mean, first of all, who were the target audience that we're asking this question? Because, I mean, consumers around the world are putting billions of dollars in telcos in the hope that they can use them the next day, a lot more than they're putting with banks. So were you asking banked people? Were you asking unbanked people? Were you asking...
It was actually, is this still on? I don't talk very loud. It was actually a pretty even mix. So we tried to get a balance across banked and unbanked consumers. I don't know if you remember, that first slide on adoption, it had the split between emerging market users, mature users, and unbanked. And we also had a fairly even split in terms of age groups. So I think it was sort of like 16 to over 55-year-olds. So we did try to make it as representative as possible. And it was a sort of a fairly balanced spread of markets. Ghana, South Africa, Guatemala, Mexico, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brazil, I think Colombia, the US, the UK, but you get the picture. So I think it is, unfortunately or fortunately, depending what sort of service provider you are, it's a fairly sort of representative response, and it is consistent with our surveys from previous years. The proportion might be slightly different, but the key message is the same. It tends to be the banks that come out on tops, followed by the sort of online payment providers like PayPal, and then operators. You're kind of hovering around third place. So that's what
I think you're asking the wrong question, Edith.
I have a question. You studied a lot the matter, so I would like to have your opinion about who is in the best position now to launch a successful mobile payment service among mobile operators, banks, OTT, and special cases like Apple.
All right, let's think of a slightly more nuanced way to look at this, because everybody thinks, oh, it's going to be Apple, the OTT players. I think it depends on the market, and it depends on the segment, the type of payment service, or rather mobile commerce service that it is. I think that in emerging markets, actually operators are in a genuinely good position. They do have mass market reach. I think a lot of them do have genuinely trusted brands. They have a strong relationship with the consumer. In some markets, they have a very dominant position as well, and possibly sort of more known at this stage at least than some of the sort of online players. Apple, as we saw, it's got a hell of a lot going for it, but Apple Pay is at the moment only available on the iPhone 6. Apple phones are extremely expensive products still for most people, and even Apple is struggling. I think it will gain more traction, and I think the sort of Apple story in payments is by no means over. I think it will launch person-to-person payments. Actually, I think sort of Android Pay is more interesting because Android is clearly a mass market OS. So I think that's one to watch. Google's payment strategy is still arguably still a bit of a mess. Google Wallet is sort of still hovering out there in the ether. It's meant to be sort of combining it with Android Pay. We're not quite sure where it's going there. The banks, clearly you guys are in a key position. You've seen the levels of trust. I think also I think this is why in the UK, Pingit and Payan are proving so successful. What banks can do very well, you can, and a lot of you are, you can layer payment applications onto an existing banking app. And I think that's a real puller for consumers. In mature markets at least, all the major retail banks have have a mobile app of some shape or form. It's almost not a differentiator anymore. So I think for banks to layer on payment applications on top of that is a pretty good way to go, pretty compelling.
Okay. So ranking what you said, so basically in the developing market, the first top position is from OTT, second from banks, and third from mobile operators.
Not necessarily. Again, it depends on the kind of segment and sort of commerce application that you're trying to address. I think operators generally can make good impact around NFC, and Ovum, we actually do have a lot of. I think NFC is actually a great technology. So it's often sort of it's failed because it's bad technology. It's not, and I think operators do potentially stand a good chance of really driving NFC. And also, a lot of them are wedded to the sort of NFC SIM implementation that's not proved that popular. But they can actually adopt hybrid solutions, which I think will draw a lot of other players into their ecosystem. I think when it comes to some of the wider mobile shopping and marketing applications, I think there some of the OTT players really can make a mark, and indeed they already are. Operators are starting to focus a little bit more on sort of remote payments, sort of consumer to business, basically mobile shopping. But a lot of these sort of OTT players, well, even OTTs, like PayPal and others like them, they've been sort of driving this area for a long time. But as I think it was, you mentioned this morning, we need to think of this in terms of an ecosystem. Operators do partner with Visa, with MasterCard, with PayPal. Apple partners with banks, so ultimately it's better if we can all play nice. Unfortunately, it's not always the case in reality. So I hope that sort of answers your question. So I think the better way to look at it is not sort of OTT players have won everything. It depends which area of the market you're focused on and which market you're in.
A very small connected question.
That's all right.
Developed markets, obviously the banks have slightly better positions than emerging markets. The operator has still coming in with dollars. There are non-banking institutions, non-operators also coming up in this space.
Yeah.
And there is a unique phenomenon of some markets where government is also in place with their own government wallets. Based on your research, these many players coexisting, wouldn't it lead to sort of an implosion consumer perspective, we can pay government payments through the government wallets. They might be interconnected. Isn't that becoming a bit crowded space and with more countries?
You're completely right, and actually I didn't sort of touch on that. I think there's got to be consolidation, and actually it's already happening. Soft card in the US being the sort of high-profile example. A market with sort of 5 or 6 fully fledged, multifunctional digital wallets, it's hard to see that as sustainable. I do put the stress on multifunctional, but yes, I think that there has to be consolidation of some shape or form. I would have imagined for most consumers that their loyalty will eventually gravitate to sort of maybe 2, 3 digital wallet applications. And maybe digital wallets as a term is slightly misleading because sometimes, it's a little opportunistic, there can be a sort of a fairly basic single focus application that's suddenly called a digital wallet. It's not necessarily, yes. So yes, I agree. I think that has
You see the card payment, because we did some research and found out that the transaction and the wallet are not necessarily below the market. B2B transactions also cut into the credit card space per se. There's an average transaction between B2B, if it moves to wallet, automatically it will affect the card businesses and the card transaction volume which are currently happening because of the consumer. Does that, from a research perspective, does it come out that the card-based digital payments versus the digital payment that you has any interlinking?
I'm not honestly sure. I mean, this might be one that's actually better addressed in the presentation. I'm not trying to deflect this afternoon, that looks more closely at those issues. Leave that with me. If you give me your card, I can sort of check on our resource and get back to you, because I don't want to give you a waffly answer. But yeah, sort of swap cards afterwards.
Hugo, you have a question? Hugo?
Yes.
You have a question?
Okay. Now, I was going to ask you about your personal opinion about PayPal. You kind of mentioned it now, because I think it's repositioning. I think the buying soon is something interesting. I mean, they could have gone into personal payments. And that's how they started. In a way, they went into being sort of quasi payment company, like competing with or partnering with credit cards. But where do you think PayPal will go in the mobile space?
I think I actually rate PayPal. And yet another cut from this big consumer survey. We actually asked consumers about named service providers as opposed to the generic question on trust, and PayPal actually came out pretty well, particularly in mature markets, as you'd expect. It's doing okay in mobile. It's kind of it's a bit of a magpie company in some respects. It'll jump on any technology that's out there and sort of will back every horse. So it's sort of got a one point of sale solution. It adopted beacons and then decided not. It was anti-NFC and now it loves it, and so on. It should have done better in mobile payments than it has, but I think now that it's separated from eBay, it should do a lot better. It should be able to sort of be more responsive, because it's a bit of a reactive company in a lot of ways. They've made some really smart acquisition. I think you mentioned Zoller, was mentioned earlier. Baintree's got Venmo as well. So I think it's going to be more sort of acquisitive in quite a smart way going forward. So I'd expect to see it do better in mobile payments than it has over the past couple of years.
Excuse me. In your analysis, do you have any correlation effect analysis between the attributes you have mentioned that things affect the security on the number of services provided by the bank or the other side?
Oh, I see what you mean.
Very important to know this.
No, we don't, because it was so you mean sort of
For example, now the customer can sacrifice some security
oh, I see.
right in terms of the number of services provided by the bank.
So you're saying that
It's correlation effect.
yeah, no, it's not so. It'd be nice to do that. it's difficult
You
to
can
actually.
provide it, someone asks you.
Yeah, we could, but with survey design, you always have to sort of ask the questions in a way that people will actually understand. And actually, one thing that's probably worth mentioning with that survey, we actually carried that out 100% mobile, which was brilliant because it gave us the ability to reach a lot of, particularly the unbanked consumers in emerging markets that we wouldn't normally have been able to. But yeah, good one for our 2016 survey. Not quite sure how to ask that, but it's really.
Okay, thank you, Eden. Fascinating presentation. You've held everyone back from their coffee breaks. But so we'll take a short coffee and networking break. We'll try and be back by 3:30 for the last session where we have Kamal talking about implementing a wallet strategy.